Some legends are told, some turn to dust or to gold, but you will remember me for centuries.
This is the Cameron Parker Show, brought to you by Spreaker, where we discuss everything from around the local professional sports scene in Colorado, such as the Denver Broncos.
Chris Harris comes out. I don't know if he was on the drive, but he said, I knew 15 seconds into that game that I should have been on T.Y. Hilton. If players are coming out and saying that, it falls again on the coaching staff.
Not to mention insiders from around your local sports scene. Ryan Spilborgs, former outfielder for your Colorado Rockies.
It's not going to be the 25 guys that leave spring training that are going to be the only guys the entire season. You need depth. You need guys that are going to be in your minor leagues that you may not expect.
Ryan Edwards.
You know, when you're talking about an offensive line, it's about the five best guys, right? And you're talking about the five best guys gelling. There hasn't been a lot of time for that.
It's showtime. Are you ready? Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. It's another edition of the Cameron Parker Show, and we are joined by, it's been a long time, feels like about a month, but we are joined by CJ Krainock, the fantasygurus.org analyst. How you doing, my man? How does it feel to be back?
Dude, I don't know how it feels to be back. Mexico was a ton of fun. My wife and I loved it. Vacation away from the kid, but it's good to be back.
It really does feel like a month, though. I mean, a lot has really happened in that span of that time that you were gone in the sports world. You and I obviously follow baseball, so I hit you up the minute the Rockies signed Wade Davis. And then obviously when I was there on Sunday to go to the Bronco game, I hear the rumblings beforehand that Vance Joseph is fired or going to be fired, and come to find out, Elway decided to have a steak dinner at Elway's by himself, sleep on it, and then wake up the next morning and say, you know what, I'm actually just going to keep him as head coach in 2018. So, but just in the span of that, just a lot has happened, in the sports world and at least locally. So, but as far as fantasy news, the championship is over, but there's always those dynasty leagues, and we'll be talking about that dynasty league, and as far as with the off season. Yeah,
I'm really excited. The fantasy playoffs just finished up. Hopefully you guys finished well in your leagues. I know I won one league out of my 5, and I lost a couple championship games. It was rough, but hence is the game. So I hope you guys finished better than I did, and I'm excited to be back and talking about it.
This is the Cameron Parker Show, so be sure to subscribe to the Cameron Parker Show on iTunes. You can also listen to us on iHeartRadio. We are also on the Amazon Echo. If you feel like talking to that Amazon Echo and saying, I want to listen to CJ Krainock on the Cameron Parker Show, then say, I want to listen to the Cameron Parker Show. And then we're also on YouTube as well. So we're everywhere, ladies and gentlemen, to start the new year, start off in 2018. So let's get right into it. We don't have a whole lot of time, but let's get it in with you. We mentioned about Dynasty. There are those off seasons when it comes to those Dynasty leagues, but who are some of the premier off-season acquisitions or just off-season moves potentially for a Dynasty team?
Yeah, so I'm going to look at some players here that have really, really low ownership. So we're talking very widely available in your leagues, and that's what you're looking at if you've got a really extensive dynasty league, which would be something that you're interested right now in the off season. So we're going to talk about some people that you can pick up before the season starts next year, so that you can have a leg up on your competition come next year. So I've got a pretty big list here, and we're going to run through them. I'll ask you what you think. Cameron, we're just going to spend 30 seconds on each guy here and a little blip why these might be good ads. Like I said before, these people are, they're very little owned, and that's for a reason this year. A lot of them didn't even play, or they're rookies and they're just coming into their own or coming into the NFL. So there might not even be people you've really heard of before, but hence is the name of the game in Dynasty. So we're going to talk about these guys. My first is a guy who really came on at the beginning of this year, who kind of fell off. And actually, the first two people on my list are Bears. With, Mitch Trubisky hopefully taking another step in his sophomore campaign, we're looking at a couple of his weapons. And the first is Tariq Cohen. And he came on strong at the beginning of the year as he was running back for the Bears. He also a return man and really just lit the league on fire for the first couple of games. And then after that, you didn't really hear from him. And that's somebody that we could really see take a big leap in 2018. Someone who has shown that they can be explosive in the NFL, and somebody that has shown that they can, just that they can be successful. And we're going to look his way in 2018. I'm not expecting top 10 running back numbers from him, but you might get the occasional return touchdown in addition to his work on the ground.
Yeah, I agree. You think of Tariq Cohen, there's always that need now, especially to have kind of that, I say flex play for a guy like a Tariq Cohen, but he's a joystick. He's a guy that can provide that valuability on special teams and in particular PPR. So I know that I had him on my team in one of them. But so he does provide a valuable element in the return game as well as in the running game. In the beginning part of the year, I think we kind of saw a glimpse potentially of that type of player that he can be with the Bears, and who knows what he could be with a guy like a Mitchell Trubisky for a full season. I think Tariq Cohen would be a pretty beneficial piece in the offseason to add.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to our next one. And Cameron, I think this is a guy that you were high on pre-draft this last year, Adam Shaheen. He's a D2 guy, tight end. He went in the second round to the Bears. Is just known for his pure athleticism. And Adam Shaheen was pretty absent all year. He had a couple good games towards the end of the season. We've heard his head coach talk about his development, how much he likes him, and I could really see him taking a year or two jump growing with Mitchell Trubisky.
You think of it coming into the draft. They think about those people because everybody wants to compare him to a baby Gronk, and Adam Shaheen was that unknown baby Gronk type player that's fluid. He's athletic. He runs incredibly well for a tight end. He catches the crap out of balls. But he's also that raw and ridiculously talented tight end. And so if you think about it, he's a tight end that, especially with a young quarterback, and Adam Shaheen is young, and Trubisky is young. They are. I could see them being a potential connection necessarily, not necessarily a wide receiver and quarterback rapport, but a tight end and quarterback rapport. And especially when you think about just a quarterback in general, the best friend necessarily of a quarterback is a tight end and a slot receiver. Look at Cooper Kupp, rookie, with the Los Angeles Rams. Now you look at the Chicago Bears and potentially what could be in year two with Adam Shaheen, hoping that he ends up emerging as the potential tight end of the future for the Chicago Bears. I think he has something there. So maybe not the baby Gronk per se, but I could easily see him, really filling that reliable tight end. Maybe like a Jesse James potentially, or a guy that's proven himself very versatile in the passing game for the Chicago Bears. So I agree.
Yeah, I think that he's a name that's not well known because he came out of a Division II school, and you just don't hear about Ashland very often. But he is somebody that you should target in your league. I'm going through ESPN's rankings right now, and he is owned in less than 0.5% of leagues.
Yeah.
0.5. And I think that he could finish as a top 15 tight end next year. I don't know if he'll crack top 10, but I could see him in that 10 to 15 range with those check down passes, and he's athletic, like you said.
Well, when you think about it, you kind of think of the history and look at back kind of what happened here with Julius Thomas. He went to, I think it was Sacramento State, or no, maybe it was Portland State. I can't remember, but it was one of those small schools. He proved himself to be a basketball player, and we all know the transition of a basketball player as far as tight end. But it took him a while. Obviously, injuries were a large part of that, but it took him a while to get to the field. I don't exactly see that type of length for a guy like Adam Shaheen, but once he hit the field, he proved that he's a playmaker on the football field. And I think that, once you kind of get more reps for a guy like an Adam Shaheen and more rapport with the young quarterback, he's just going to blossom every single year. So, I just think the sky's the limit for the guy. Even though I kind of said that he could be a Jesse James, I still feel the sky's the limit for a player like that.
Yeah, absolutely. He's more athletic than a Jesse James to me. I think he's got more potential in that. But I think you're right. I could see him in that kind of role next year with that kind of points. And Jesse James was startable in quite a few games. So look towards his way for dynasty leagues. He could be a guy you keep around for a couple years and maybe longer than that if he really blossoms into what he could be. We talked about the tight end class a lot last year and how great it was. And he was right there at the top of those names. He just didn't have the Division I production that a lot of these other guys had, but he was just as athletic or more athletic than the other, O.J. Howard and the other people that he was testing with. So let's go on. I'm going to talk about an older guy here real quick, which you don't think of a lot of in dynasty leagues. But Danny Woodhead had pretty much a busted year with the Ravens because of injury, and which has become a theme in his career, don't get me wrong. But he still has a lot of potential as a pass catcher, and a lot of dynasty leagues use PPR format, and Danny Woodhead is a PPR monster.
Is he a free agent in the offseason, or did he sign a 2-3 year? I can't remember, but I think he signed a multi-year contract with the Ravens. But you think of the Baltimore Ravens, they need a guy that is as versatile as that. They've seen time and time again what the New England Patriots have done to them, in the postseason and everything like that. So they really do need and it really isn't just the Baltimore Ravens, though. I mean, there are a lot of teams in the National Football League that truly do need those versatile backs, and Danny Woodhead at one point in time was the cream of the crop of those type of backs. And I think the lack of production could potentially doom him. But I think that he could provide some value if it's an incredibly deep league. Then a guy like a Danny Woodhead could be very serviceable for a lineup. But I do think, while I do think he's a phenomenal player and a very underappreciated player for what he does, I just, it's hard not to go off of history. And history shows that he is injury prone. And so there's no telling how far he will finish, or even if he will finish the regular season next year.
Danny Woodhead's one of those guys where I would look to maybe acquire him while somebody's super down on him, and then maybe he has a couple good games to start next year, and you flip him for a high draft pick on a contending team. So that's in a dynasty league, that's really valuable. Somebody that you can flip next year for a draft pick, and I think Danny Woodhead is one of those guys. He has the potential to have a pretty good year, and you have the potential to get more than you paid for out of him. So I think, with the injury proneness, you probably don't want to stick with him all next year, but he's, in my eyes, probably worth owning because he didn't play the way he could have this year. I don't see him starting the year off that way next year. We'll move on. We'll move on to our next guys here. I'm going to group these guys together, talk about them real quick. Corey Davis and Corey Coleman are two Corey wide receivers. Corey Davis being the first-round wide receiver last year, never really got going. Neither did really Marcus Mariota. But I could see a year or two jump from him now that he's learned the system. He's not hurt, and he's going to have a full camp to work with Mariota. And Corey Coleman, I just see him. He's going into his third year. He He needs to show improvement. I think they're going to have a new quarterback next year, hopefully better. Hopefully. So you can only hope that Corey Coleman playing number 2 to Josh Gordon will be able to flourish more in that role.
I think that's the hope, is that they draft a quarterback. But also, they need to have some continuity, So, I mean, who knows? Deshaun Kaiser might come in and light it up in his sophomore season. And I think that's kind of the problem with the Browns, is there's no continuity at all in the quarterback position. And until they have continuity in the quarterback position of getting a stable quarterback, they're going to have those types of lack of production from a lot of players that I frankly think are incredibly skilled. Guys like Duke Johnson and Corey Coleman being another, and then even throw another rookie in there, David Njoku. So I think that they're a very young team on offense with some of their playmakers. And I mean, I would say their most prized target is still Josh Gordon, and he hasn't even been in the league, for a handful of years. So, but a guy like that will take a lot of the load off of a guy like a Corey Coleman. So all they really need is a steady quarterback. I love Corey Coleman. Corey Davis, I love a lot. I actually had him as my top wide receiver coming into the draft last year. This year. I had him as the top wide receiver in the draft this year. Mike Williams ended up getting hurt. But Corey Davis is a very interesting guy. He has that type of build and running ability like a Demaryius Thomas, but he is at times very fleet of foot like Antonio Brown at times. So it's just he's a very interesting breed, and we have to appreciate guys like that because of the ability to run after the catch. His ability to run after the catch and also high point a ball at its highest point, or they call it those 50-50 balls. He can do it with the best of them, and I don't think it's far-fetched to think that by the end of the season next year that Corey Davis could find himself in let's just say top 10, top 15 category of wide receivers, because I do foresee Marcus Mariota having a much better year.
Yeah, I think that too, especially what you said about Corey Davis. I think fantasy league wise, I think you can find an owner in a lot of leagues that will have given up on him because of this poor year that he has started out with, and will trade him to you for less than you would have paid 16 games ago. So I think this is a good off-season target for you early in the off-season, because I think he's going to be on a lot of people's breakout lists next year, and you want to get him before those breakout lists come out. So I would be looking at him right now, somebody who is disgruntled because they lost their league and had Corey Davis, and he was supposed to be the savior. Go target him, throw a low draft pick their way, and see if we'll give him up. So our last group of people right here, we're going to talk about quarterbacks, because this is the position everybody wants to take care of in your dynasty league. And two guys that I have on here that are owned in less than 5% of leagues are Pat Mahomes and Teddy Bridgewater. And Cameron, I'll let you talk about those guys real quick.
Well, Patrick Mahomes, it's interesting. If Patrick Brooks and I were actually talking about it when I went to the game against the Chiefs, I feel like if Patrick Mahomes was on the Denver Broncos, we would be talking about a divisional title probably, for the Denver Broncos that season. Now, granted, there's certainly a lot of other issues at play for the Denver Broncos during that season and during this season that probably would have overshadowed all of that. But he's an incredibly talented guy. And you think of all the guys at a Texas Tech University and the history of the quarterbacks that have gone through that college, it's not very good. I mean, they just haven't never translated. I mean, they're probably most longevity of a quarterback that has played in the National Football League was probably Cole Brennan, and he wasn't even with the program for a while. I think he started with Texas Tech and transferred to Hawaii for the last 2 years, and then he came to the NFL draft. Cliff Kingsbury is the current head coach at Texas Tech, and then you have what he did of lighting up the college, record books with his passing yards and touchdowns and everything like that. But he never panned out in the National Football League. So you get a guy like a Patrick Mahomes who can clearly prove to sling it all over the field. He has a incredible knack of mobility to escape a pocket, which you don't really see in a spread offense. And I think that's why it makes a guy like that a little bit more attractive than a guy like a Blaine Gabbert when he was coming out of college, about 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. I can't remember. And so then you look at the type of ability that he can have, and I think the sky's the limit for him. He was my favorite quarterback coming out of the draft last year for his ability to just sling it all over the yard and be fairly accurate when he was on the run. And he can also show the ability to throw accurately in the pocket and show decent pocket awareness. This is not a fantasy take, obviously, but the true fantasy take, though, is whether or not the team is committed to Alex Smith as starting quarterback. Usually when you go up and you draft a quarterback at number 10 and you trade significant amount of trade or draft capital to draft Patrick Mahomes at 10, it's almost like you're banking on the fact that Alex Smith will not be your starter in 2018. And so Patrick Mahomes could potentially be an option to start next year. And I think that when you think about it, this compares favorably to Patrick Mahomes versus Teddy Bridgewater. But you think of the weapons that Patrick Mahomes would have versus the weapons that Teddy Bridgewater would have. Teddy Bridgewater would have Latavius Murray and Jared McKinnon, Stephon Diggs, and Adam Thielen. Still really good options. But then you look at and also Kyle Rudolph. But, I still would rather take the options that I have at Kansas City as far as wide receiver and the running back necessarily over the Minnesota Vikings. So but it is a fairly similar situation of a young quarterback, the weapons that they have. So I would probably give the nod to Patrick Mahomes as far as fantasy value.
Yeah, I would look his way too. Also because we know of Teddy Bridgewater's injury history, and you being in a dynasty league, if you're listening to this, then you're going to need your quarterback to last more than a season or two, or play the whole season. And Bridgewater, there's a lot of question marks around that. He almost didn't have a leg to play on, a year ago. So it's miraculous he's even come this far, and I commend Teddy Bridgewater for that. But you can't ignore the fact that it happened. I know that the team, I think that they're committed to Teddy Bridgewater. I really do. But that doesn't mean that you have to disregard all history about him. And Pat Mahomes, if you're in Dynasty League, he's young, he's talented, he has opportunity, he's throwing to Tyreek Hill, and he's got a huge arm. I will take that all day. And, I think, like what you're just saying, Pat Mahomes is a guy that I would target. But I would target Teddy Bridgewater, too, if you're desperate at quarterback in a Dynasty League. If you have somebody that's low on him because of his injury history, if you're desperate, take a shot at Teddy B.
And lastly, as far as quarterbacks and with the opportunity to bolster your roster, and this is something I probably should focus on considering I had no quarterbacks in our fantasy league, and they all went away on a stretcher. It's okay, you can laugh.
It's all right. Yeah, that happened to a lot of people this year.
We're talking the quarterbacks in this upcoming draft, because we said we were going to touch on it as far as the draft quarterbacks and the draft running backs necessarily. Who in your mind, we touched on it a little bit briefly when you were on about a few weeks ago, but as far as some of the quarterbacks in your estimation, who are the fantasy value quarterbacks?
Obviously, this is early, and we acknowledge that, to be talking about fantasy quarterbacks because we don't know where they're going to land, and that has a lot to do with it. And considering who's going to declare, because we've seen rumors, and with the Browns picking at the top, there might be a couple guys that stay in school. But who we think is going to declare right now, Josh Rosen is my guy, fantasy-wise, because I think he's not going to go to the Browns, which is great for your fantasy team. You don't want to draft a Browns quarterback, because I see Sam Darnold going ahead of him if he declares. And Josh Rosen will fall down to a little bit better team, I believe. That's attractive. He just has the it factor to me. He has it kind of like Baker Mayfield does, although I'm a little sketched out by Baker Mayfield. I hope he makes it, though, because he's so fun to watch.
Yeah.
But Josh Rosen has the it factor for me. He looks like a professional quarterback. He's got the arm. He's got the talent. He's following a guy out. We've seen Jared Goff have success. He's the next guy coming out to the same school. So
Not the same school.
Oh, sorry. No, you're right.
Yeah.
But he looks the part. He acts the part. I like some Jared Goff, and he's outspoken, and I like that in a quarterback because I think that kind of attitude garners support from your teammates, as long as you're not outspoken about things that your teammates, against your teammates, which I don't think he is.
Well,
but
I was just going to say, and then the other stuff that maybe he talks a little too much as far as some of the off-the-field stuff. That could be a distraction.
Yeah, he could be a distraction. But at the same time, there's same thing with Cam Newton. Maybe Cam Newton talks too much, but I don't know a teammate out there who wouldn't fight for Cam Newton.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying Josh Rosen is Cam Newton, but there are quarterbacks who have been very outspoken in the past, and it hasn't ever been a big deal. But then you have your Johnny Manziels, where it was atrocious. I don't see Josh Rosen as Johnny Manziel, and for the record, I don't see Baker Mayfield as Johnny Manziel either.
Well, I was gonna say you bring up some fantasy quarterbacks. You never mentioned Lamar Jackson.
Yeah, and I think Lamar Jackson. I watched the bowl game, and I saw somebody who looked to run way too often, and doesn't have the frame of a Cam Newton to take the pounding that would be in the NFL. I just constantly saw his eyes go from downfield, and this might have been the pressure that he was facing, but he was so quick to run, and that concerned me a little bit. I do think that he has a future in the league. I don't even know if it's at quarterback. I hope somebody gives him a shot, but if you're in a dynasty league, I'd be a little sketched out about Lamar Jackson because I think you might get a year of him at quarterback where he's like an RG3 or Colin Kaepernick. But look where RG3 and Colin Kaepernick are now. If you're in a dynasty league, I wouldn't want, it's not worth the one or two good seasons for the 10 of, them not even being in the league. So, that sketches me out, but I think a lot of people have been talking about him as a wide receiver. I could see that being a slot guy, kind of making that Terrell Pryor transition. I could see that a lot, but I know you have stronger feelings about Lamar Jackson than I do.
Well, I do, but I just think it's just because of the actual athlete that he is. We haven't seen a tremendous athlete move like that, like Michael Vick. Now, I think once that he's in the pocket, Lamar Jackson, and he really does go through his reads and he understands and he finds that open receiver, actually finds the open receiver, he has a cannon for an arm. He really does. But it's just the ability for him to stay in the pocket. That's basically the biggest question for Lamar Jackson. And the other biggest question is, can he add about 20 more pounds? Can he add a little bit more bulk? Or can he do what Russell Wilson has done and avoid hits like no other? I mean, Russell Wilson is probably the best as probably being one of the more healthy quarterbacks that has not sustained significant injuries because of the blows that he's taken. And considering the offensive line that he's had at Seattle. So I do think that Lamar Jackson has a future in the NFL. It's kind of like a Baker Mayfield, maybe to a point. And I think that this is why it's a little bit attractive for Denver to use as an example, because they've gutted their entire staff, quote unquote, except for an offensive coordinator. And so now you can hedge on maybe making a staff potentially for your new quarterback. And if you can do that for a guy like a Baker Mayfield or a guy like a Lamar Jackson, they are going to succeed in my mind. Particularly Baker Mayfield. I was going to say particularly Baker Mayfield, because if you can get a guy like a Baker Mayfield and mold an Alex Smith type offense for him with read option and kind of that type of plays to get it out to your best playmakers, the Baker Mayfield will be absolutely special because of his ability to make plays happen in the open field.
And I do like the Alex Smith comparison in the offensive type that they could run. Alex Smith just takes a beat down from the press and from the media about the offense that he runs because he's the check down artist, right? But the results speak for himself, and Alex Smith is an above average quarterback. He is. And he's showed it time and time again that he can play in the NFL, that he's a quality quarterback, and that you can win with him. But the one thing that Alex Smith doesn't bring to the table is the fire that Baker Mayfield does, and I love that. And that you can't teach that. So I love the comparisons with the offense with Alex Smith, but I think that you have even more potential in that same kind of offense with Baker Mayfield.
Yeah. And
I like your comment about building a staff around your quarterback, and that's the kind of stuff that I look for if I'm drafting a fantasy quarterback. Whether in Dynasty League or if you're just looking for, you probably won't pick a rookie to be your starting quarterback next year if you're in a redraft league, but maybe a backup. Is somebody that the offense is going to be built around them. And I think you could have seen that with Deshaun Watson coming, as somebody that they were fully committed to being their future quarterback and designing, out of the gate. The first game Deshaun Watson played, you could tell that offense was made for him.
Yeah.
And, and you missed out if you didn't draft him. Pat Mahomes, I think, is the same way. That, he's going to a good system with good coaches in place. So that's what I look for, is I hope Baker Mayfield ends up with a staff that is going to help him flourish, because you can have all the talent in the world, but if you end up in Cleveland, it's just not very promising for your future, as we've seen time and time again.
Are you saying that the best possible scenario is for Baker to go to the Broncos?
I think so. I think so, because he is a Bronco mentality. That defense, and you think of the mentality of that defense and the fire that they had, that they kind of almost lost this last year, being the no-fly zone. Baker Mayfield fits that mold. He is that. And I think they would just feed off of each other, that fire.
Yeah.
I do think the best-case scenario is Baker Mayfield goes to the Broncos. I don't know necessarily who that means in round one, or at least where the Broncos are picking in round one.
Right.
Maybe trade down and get a couple picks and get Mayfield later. But with the amount of quality quarterbacks in this, and I think a couple of them will test pretty well, I don't know if he's going to slip far enough. So you might have to take him at 5 if you're the Broncos. But, I think that's the best-case scenario for Baker Mayfield. You hope he doesn't end up on a team like the Giants. You hope he doesn't end up on the Browns somehow. You hope there's a number of places you just hope he doesn't land. Miami, you don't want him going there, but Denver makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's what I look for when I'm drafting a fantasy quarterback, is somebody who went to a place that made sense.
Real quick, final take, because we're going to touch on running backs real quick, and then we can send you off. Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley is a guy that, frankly, is, in my estimations, the best running back prospect I have ever seen. Better than Ezekiel Elliott, but he's the best running back I have ever seen since Adrian Peterson, and maybe even a little bit before that. But it feels like he's an Adrian Peterson mixed in with a Le'Veon Bell. And I think that the Denver Broncos, and they are in a perfect situation right now as far as how they want to upgrade their team. And I think that it's in large part why they gutted their entire roster. Or their staff, I should say. The Denver Broncos, I think, clearly it's been known that they are all in on Kirk Cousins. I mean, the players kind of were outspoken about it when they played Washington, that they would kill to have a quarterback like Kirk Cousins, which is basically throwing a hint that they wanted Kirk Cousins.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do too. Yeah, I do too.
Right. I think as far as a point, and an underrated point, is we're talking about college. Getting a guy like Kirk Cousins, getting the chance to go back into a time machine and get a really good running back and play with a great defense, and getting that great running back with your top 5 pick being a Saquon Barkley, I think would do massive wonders for that team.
If the Broncos signed Kirk Cousins and drafted Saquon Barkley in the same offseason, I would go as far to say that would be the greatest offseason ever for the Broncos. And I know that means a lot because there was Peyton Manning a couple years ago. But I would almost go so far as to say that offense would completely transform in just one offseason. It'd be completely different.
Yeah. And I think that that's just because of what Barkley brings to the table. And that Cousins would officially have comfortability now of having a guy that he can rely on in the passing game and in the running game, much like what he had on Le'Veon Bell with Michigan State. But what's your thoughts on as far as fantasy value for a guy like a Saquon Barkley? Maybe a few running backs sprinkled in.
Saquon Barkley, no matter where he lands, I don't even care. He's the number one guy in my rookie rankings next year. I'm not even going to take a further look at it unless he gets hurt, somehow. He will be number one. I've watched him play a few games now, and every single time I watch him, I just, wow. He makes a 0-yard gain for Penn State look good.
Right.
I mean, he'll get hit 4 times in the backfield and still make it to the line of scrimmage, and that the box score will say he had 0 yards on that play, but those were hard fought. Nobody else is getting those 0. And that's not an exaggeration. He's that good. And then you see him in open space. He straight up jumped over a man when I was watching last time. Last game I watched Saquon Barkley, he just straight up hurdled a guy who was standing up. I don't even know, with the power and the finesse that he has, he's number one for me. No discussion about it.
He's my O.J. Howard draft crush this year.
Yeah, but hopefully it's a better year than O.J. Howard.
Yeah, who might actually, going back to Dynasty and as far as those people, who might actually end up seeing himself with a breakout year in his sophomore campaign. We'll see.
Yeah, I can see that too.
Well, hey, CJ, thank you very much, man, for your time, and we'll try and get some baseball talk here in the next few days and talk about the Rockies, talk about the signing of Wade Davis, and amongst some other things. But you have a good night, man, and we will talk soon.
All right, you too. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, good. Yeah, you have a good one, man. We'll talk soon.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. That was CJ Krainock, ladies and gentlemen, and when we come back, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about the Denver Broncos, kind of unravel a little bit, because we did talk a little bit of some Denver Broncos talk about some Saquon Barkley, the pairing necessarily of what it might potentially mean with a guy like a Kirk Cousins, and especially this season. We want to unravel exactly what happened this season. This is the Cameron Parker Show. Please feel free, comment on the Spreaker chat line, and also tweet at me at Cameron Parker PO. Follow CJ as well at Cal Krainock 21. This is the Cameron Parker Show, and we'll be right back.
I will rise. Your light is breaking through the night. I'm breathing in the air of life. Not giving in, this is my fight. Come break me down, every part of me. Nothing can stop me now. Awaken, holy fire, breathe life into my soul. 'Cause we're ready for revival. Come awaken the
This is the Cam Barker Show right here on Spreaker, and you guys can subscribe to the Cam Barker Show podcast on iTunes as well as listen on iHeartRadio. Follow my Twitter handle at Cameron Parker PO, as well as the show handle at CP_show. Let's try and get as much live plays as we can. If you are tuning in live, thank you guys very much for making the Cameron Parker Show part of your guys' evening. We've been talking about the Denver Broncos for, well, quite some time during this regular season, and we put forth a poll question, just kind of understanding where potentially would you give a leash like a guy like Vance Joseph, who was reported at the beginning part of the game that at least this last Sunday, that Vance Joseph was in fact fired, and then come to find out, John Elway felt like he was comfortable enough to sleep on it, go and have some steak dinner at his restaurant, and then wake up the next morning and decide, well, you know what, I feel like I'm going to retain Vance Joseph. And sure enough, it sure seemed like he gave him an ultimatum. An ultimatum that included gutting the entire coaching staff. And I want to understand where you guys certainly are on some of these coaching staff changes. There were a few surprises. Eric Studesville being let go, and Tyke Tolbert necessarily also being let go. There are certainly some rumblings that there are going to be some changes potentially in the Denver Broncos roster, and it will be interesting to see where they go. Does the release of Eric Studesville potentially mean that there could be some changes on the horizon with the Denver Broncos roster at running back? It's tough to see, tough to tell, but I will tell you, that Eric Studesville is pretty well thought of around the National Football League, and so seeing a guy like that, seeing the response of CJ Anderson basically voicing his opinion, saying it's BS, kind of tells you potentially of how the Broncos players felt about it. He was an interim head coach twice, if I'm not mistaken, and so Studesville, this allows him to catch an opportunity of potentially being a head coaching candidate sometime, maybe in the near future. Maybe it's even this season. He's actually going to be interviewing with the New York Football Giants. So I think really when you look at the grand scheme of things of this Denver Broncos season, while I was certainly been on the fence of wanting to let Vance Joseph go, it's understandable of why they want to keep Vance Joseph. Think about it. Historically, Vance Joseph, at least with a first-year head coach, you never want to fire a first-year head coach. And especially when you think of the fact that the Denver Broncos had John Fox entering the 2014 season. They decided to fire John Fox, and then they went with Gary Kubiak. And then after Gary Kubiak, or then when Gary Kubiak came on, they made the Super Bowl. They won the Super Bowl, and then Gary Kubiak, in fact, wanted to retire. So do they really want to have 3 head coaches in 4 years? I think that really was weighing heavily on the mind of John Elway, and I believe that ultimately he thought it best to retain Vance Joseph once he slept on it. Now, here's the thing, is that I do believe that he gave him an ultimatum. And that ultimatum was that he needs to gut about the entire staff. And now this affords, potentially with Bill Musgrave, which was a great decision to remove the interim tag off of Bill Musgrave. This affords the Denver Broncos now, and more importantly, Vance Joseph, to formulate the staff that he wants. Obviously, he really would like to grab his defensive coordinator and offensive coordinator potentially, but those two will be staying. Joe Woods and Bill Musgrave will be staying. I would imagine Bill Collar will be retained as well, knowing the success that the defensive line had. So I do imagine Bill Collar will be staying. But there's been the surprises. I didn't think Tyke Tolbert or Eric Studesville would be let go. So who knows potentially what could happen there. the other issue for the Denver Broncos is that who was the offensive coordinator that was before Bill Musgrave? It was Mike McCoy. There's a comment made by Vance Joseph today that really led me to believe that maybe he is the puppet of John Elway after all. And that may seem crass, that may seem cruel. But he made a comment today. He made a comment today that said that that Bill Musgrave ran the offense the way that he wanted it to run and the way that he saw that he and Elway wanted it run. That's a pretty staggering, I would imagine, some potential blame being thrown at Mike McCoy. And I think that you could make an argument, and I think that as far as some of the reasons potentially, as far as why the offense was so inept and was just at so many different struggling odds of trying to succeed every single Sunday, I think Mike McCoy was a huge reason as to why they felt that way. And then for a guy that had so much potential of a guy that was going to be a head coach and the now offensive coordinator, it's now looked bad on Mike McCoy's resume that he feels like he was there. It looks like he had Peyton Manning back there in the pocket and that he felt like he wanted to win games with Trevor Siemian. And you just can't do that. Trevor Siemian hasn't even put forth an effort to potentially want to win games from the quarterback position. He did it in Dallas, and I think that that Mike McCoy just got absolutely greedy, and then once he saw that, and then really you look at what they did in that Giants game. They saw the winless Giants, and they just felt, we're going to just break everything that we had on offense and make sure that we can sling it 40 to 50 times a game and feel like that's the recipe for success, when CJ Anderson, who has proven to be a very valuable part of that team, and while the 1,000 yards certainly look good, really look good, I just feel like there isn't much there. Even there could have been so much more desired with that running game as well. And so for Mike McCoy to even abandon the running game, knowing what he had with Tim Tebow and knowing the potential running game that was there with Tim Tebow, and then the running game that was also valuable when Peyton Manning was here, when he had no Sean Moreno and Willis McGahee, there is that go-between and the middle ground of understanding that there is a running game that is so valuable in the National Football League, and Mike McCoy reverted away from that. And it's important that he understands Bill Musgrave, or at least for Bill Musgrave, he understands that. He understands the importance of a running game on a football team. And I think that even then you start to see a little bit of some continuity of Paxton Lynch working with Bill Musgrave. He was in shotgun predominantly the entire game on Sunday. And while he missed some certain throws, he had a bad interception on a fourth down, but he made really good throws. Throws that were being talked about in practice. Throws that were now officially being translated from practice to a game. And that is the type of play that will keep you on an NFL roster in 2018. And I think if you are the Denver Broncos, and I think John Elway put it best, they still don't have the true evaluation of a Paxton Lynch except for an injury against Oakland. And I ultimately believe if you are the head coach of the Denver Broncos, and that is Vance Joseph, and you are the front office of the Denver Broncos, and that's John Elway, Joe Ellis, and now Gary Kubiak, as he was promoted to a new role, which is the best possible scenario for the Denver Broncos, who have one of the smallest departments of front office personnel. It now affords them the opportunity to still see what they have in Paxton Lynch, which is something I've been saying all along. The best case scenario. Now, I said the best case scenario is for Paxton Lynch to be the starter potentially next year because of how cheap he is. But also the best case scenario is that he remains on the roster. That you still see what you have in the guy, and knowing that Brock Osweiler and Trevor Siemian more than likely will not be back next year. So I think that Paxton Lynch played himself back on the Denver Broncos roster, ladies and gentlemen. And I think if you look at it, the amount that he played and played well with certain throws and making the right read and, you know, making a few wow throws every now and again. You know, there were times where he threw where he would end up throwing the pass to Isaiah McKenzie. I think it was near in the end zone, but McKenzie was a little too small for a receiver, not to be, mean, but McKenzie was a little small as a wide receiver. So I think that if he had a much bigger wide receiver there, he probably would have been able to make a play and have a touchdown. But that's just the unfamiliarity with a guy like an Isaiah McKenzie and trying to understand where the ball should be for a guy like an Isaiah McKenzie. And so I think for a guy like Paxton Lynch, that this is a great first step for a guy like Paxton Lynch, who played his best game like he did against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So it's important for Paxton Lynch to really file this one away in the good category and move forward to next year. And then another point is that maybe there is something there with Vance Joseph as far as him wanting to put together his own staff. And I realize that the amount of crap that Broncos certainly would put on Ben McAdoo, I was one of them, and his ability to be a head coach. But there are those coaches out there of potentially being single-focused or potentially maybe just a one aperture looking through just one lens, and that they can be really great at that. And I think that Ben McAdoo, and it's rumored that he could possibly be the quarterback coach at the Denver Broncos, I think is a phenomenal move potentially if it happens as quarterback coach. He can learn from a guy like a Bill Musgrave. And I honestly believe that it's also the best case scenario given the flexibility it could give for the Broncos as far as wanting to go after Kirk Cousins or wanting to draft a guy like a Baker Mayfield, a Josh Rosen, or potentially a Sam Darnold if it happens that he decides to declare. It gives them that opportunity that they want to draft a young quarterback. They want to mold it potentially for the offense that is going to potentially be whoever it is. And knowing Gary Kubiak, they want to end up having that type of, play action, rollout offense, the one that Kubiak has done so well with Joe Flacco. And you think back to him as an offensive coordinator and the amount of times that they were so exceptional at it. There just is so much intrigue and making it so that and I don't want to make this comparison because it could, kind of perk people's eyebrows up a little bit, but I'm going to go out and say it. I feel that if the Denver Broncos decide to hire a Ben McAdoo, and while it's single-focused, Ben McAdoo could, in my estimation, have the same amount of impact on the offensive side of the ball that Wade Phillips potentially gave the defense of the Broncos in 2015, just the amount of coaching that he did and just giving free reign for them to do what they do. And I think Bill Musgrave is going to be a huge part of that because he's the offensive coordinator. And so both of them can work hand in hand. Bill Musgrave and Ben McAdoo can work hand in hand and kind of be two peas in a pod on trying to construct exactly what they need to do. And so I believe that if you look at everything with both of them, they would mesh incredibly well. And whether Ben McAdoo feels like he wants to be another head coach or not, personally, I agree. As I was talking to Sayer Bettinger before, throughout the day today, I feel that Ben McAdoo is best served for being a quarterback coach or offensive coordinator, just that type of role. And having that opportunity, the continuity for him, like a Jeff Davidson and like the potential what it was on paper last offseason, is that it gives the Broncos the opportunity to have varying different people that could be offensive coordinators in the near future. And I think back to especially the Broncos, and especially with the staff, that no matter what has unfolded, that I believe that you have to show the ultimate patience with a guy like a Bill Musgrave. And if you can do that, and Vance Joseph and the head and the front office, John Elway, everybody else included, is showing enough patience in a guy like a Bill Musgrave for him to make those decisions and really maybe take that next step with a guy like maybe a Paxton Lynch, or maybe a guy potentially that they can mold their offense around, like a guy like a Baker Mayfield, or a guy that, you know, could end up being a guy like a Kirk Cousins. You know, just the ability to mesh well with Kirk Cousins, and Kirk Cousins fits that Gary Kubiak mold, and I think Kirk Cousins has proven that he's a much better quarterback than Joe Flacco, and then you give this whole situation that they can maybe give him enough pieces around him to the point where, well, really, he can really make it so that all the pieces are going to work together. And you think back, well, maybe they do end up cutting Emmanuel Sanders or trading Emmanuel Sanders. But to think about it, everybody as far as the wide receivers go, except for maybe Isaiah McKenzie, Cody Latimer, he ends up getting re-signed. Demaryius Thomas, Carlos Henderson, all three of those guys, and maybe Jordan Taylor as well, thrown into that mix, all of those guys are really tremendous blockers, and they fit that type of mold to try and block and create opportunities for a guy like a Devontae Booker or a guy like a CJ Anderson if he's still on the roster. It provides so much potentially with for a Broncos offense that is in dire need for continuity. You heard certainly in the Cameron Parker Show intro, Ryan Edwards talk about the offensive line. But it goes hand in hand necessarily with the offense in general. There has to be continuity in the offense for the Denver Broncos. The past two seasons, well, and then really even into the 2015 season when they brought in the offensive lineman from the Philadelphia Eagles, and I can't remember his name. His name is surpassing me. Mathis. The Mathis guard that used to play for the Phillies. But when they brought him in, they brought him in during preseason. They brought him into the regular season, I believe. And there was so much continuity on that offensive line with Max Garcia and all those guys with Paris and everybody else. There's a lot of continuity there. But the problem is that once they kind of threw a wrench potentially into that, there was a lot of opportunity for that mesh, for that continuity to be absolutely obliterated. And I think that ever since then, in the last 3 years, there hasn't been nearly enough continuity at the offensive line. And I think that John Elway really has to look... I really do believe that if you look at it, and you look at it from the Broncos' perspective, they, at least for John Elway's perspective, is trying to find potential moves for the Denver Broncos. I believe if you are John Elway, you need to try your honest to goodness best to try and scrap the swing tackle mentality. You can have a few sprinkled in and there. You can have a few sprinkled as far as offensive linemen here and there. But the idea of having guys like Tyson Brilo and Michael Schofield and Donald Stevenson and now maybe a Menelik Watson maybe potentially being thrown in there as well. There's just so many swing tackles. It's just the unpredictability, of all of it. And I realize trying to cover all the bases for everything. As far as an offense, I get that. The versatility creates a lot of options for you as an offensive line. But in order to get that versatility, you should also have some continuity. And like I was talking about earlier, there has been no continuity whatsoever with the offensive line. And so John Elway has to do whatever he can to find either a sole left tackle, convert Bowles to right tackle. I'm open to any possibility on that offensive line. And that means, ladies and gentlemen, of getting rid of a guy like Matt Paradis if need be. He's a restricted free agent, I believe. And so if a team decides to come calling and want to sign Matt Paradis and the Broncos choose, well, we want to match him, we don't want to match him, and get a potential second-round tender on him, then I think that you move Connor McGovern to center. You draft maybe a guy like a Will Hernandez, a guy that is very familiar with Sean Kugler, the UTEP head coach that is interviewing for the offensive line coach position for the Denver Broncos. If that ends up all happening, then you have a very good and upgraded offensive line. And there's also the opportunity that they could draft a Quentin Nelson. So you get a guy like a Will Hernandez potentially, and then you have a Quentin Nelson waiting in the wings. So now you have a Ronald Leary potentially on the left guard or right guard. And then after it, you have just way more continuity of potentially getting a left tackle or trading for a left tackle, or even maybe kicking the tires again on wanting to trade for Cordy Glenn. Maybe see if he wants to take a little bit of some less money, play right tackle, or so on and so forth. But really, I think the ultimate option for the Broncos is they still have to upgrade the offensive line. They do have to look at tight end. And we could play a greedy situation that the Broncos should go after a guy like a Jimmy Graham to go along with the Jake Butt and maybe give Kirk Cousins that playmaker tight end that he can throw to, and to go along with a guy like a Jake Butt. But ultimately, if you really boil down to it, as far as the reasons why the Denver Broncos were 5-11 this year, the coaching I think is a big deal, but it really boils down to the quarterback position, and it boils down to 100% the quarterback position, no matter what. And I think that does Vance Joseph deserve a leash? I think he does. And we put a poll question up on the Cam Parker Show Twitter handle at CP_show. So please be sure to follow that. But we put forward this Twitter poll, the producers and I, and a lot of people. I was a little bit surprised because I thought that there were more people probably more in tune with a mid-season leash, which I would tend to agree with, than just right out of the gate, 1 and 2, weeks 1 and 2. Because if you fire a guy right out of the gate after weeks 1 and 2, unless there is something massive, I mean massive, going on behind the scenes, then for one, you should have just fired him off the get-go. But two, it's going to look bad for you even if you fire a guy after the first few weeks. And I get it. I absolutely get the scenario that if it's absolutely bad right now, and especially with a business, that why not just get rid of it right now? But again, typically you want to see growth from your second year head coach. And if you're not going to see potential growth midway part of the season with Vance Joseph, I say you get rid of it, or you get rid of Vance Joseph. So ultimately, I think it's important that Vance Joseph has shown now that he can, at least aside from offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator, that he can put a staff together. And now this will be the ultimate test. This is going to be the ultimate test potentially for Vance Joseph. And this could end up being him as far as what makes or breaks him is the potential staff that he puts together. Because he's going to have to put together that type of coach and cover all his bases as a staff. And I think that that's why he brought Mike McCoy in. For a lot of reasons. But I think that he has to cover all the bases as far as wanting to be, that if it just so ends up being that he ends up being let go, that it's in good hands to go and potentially be an interim head coach, no matter who that could potentially be. Is it a Bill Musgrave? Or if Ben McAdoo is hired, and do they want to go to a Ben McAdoo? The easy choice, in my opinion, would potentially be Bill Musgrave, because of the committal that the front office did as far as already removing the interim tag off of him. Ultimately, the Denver Broncos season has shown that there are still a lot of needs on this team, but more importantly, this team could still very well be a playoff team if the quarterback play was right. And they have to show that they can have better quarterback play. And John Elway said it today that the quarterback is the number one priority for this team. Now, will that retrace and go back on their steps and get a guy like a Colin Kaepernick, who Colin Kaepernick should have been the quarterback of the Denver Broncos a few years ago, at least last year? Or is it going after the draft and going the draft again and getting a guy like a Baker Mayfield? Or is it hedging all of your bets as a front office and potentially signing Kirk Cousins to an absolutely massive offer in hopes that the Washington Redskins cannot match it? That's really the ultimate question. And will it end up being a Kirk Cousins? And, well, I put it out there today, but it's safe to say that if the Denver Broncos do bring in Ben McAdoo, that Eli Manning will not be coming to Denver. And the amount of relationship that was severed with Ben McAdoo and Eli Manning. So we'll see potentially where the Denver Broncos go. And we'll be talking a lot about it more on the Cam Parker Show. But thank you guys very much for making the Cam Parker Show part of your evening. We will be back on Friday, and we'll be seeing if we can touch base and get a little bit more as far as a no breaks and have a no break podcast talking the Denver Broncos with a potential person on if we can, and we'll see if we can do that. Thank you guys very much for tuning into the Cam Parker Show. We will be back on Friday, and I'll be back at 7 o'clock in the usual time slot. This has been the Cam Parker Show. Please be sure to follow the Cam Parker Show at CP_show. Follow the personal handle that I have at Cameron Parker PO, and also follow CJ Krainock, who was on earlier at Cal Krainock 21. This is the Cam Parker Show. Thank you guys very much, and I hope you guys had a safe New Year's. I know that I did. This is the Cam Parker Show.